Thank you for the very kind invitation to be part of this meeting and to be able to discuss your manifesto. I want to thank Karina and Paul in advance for their time and for being here. So thank you to both of you. And we have about 25 minutes, so we have to keep it short, but a lot of territory to cover. So I'm going to move fairly swiftly into the discussion. And we have three blocks that we would like to cover. I discussed this with Karina and with Paul before this session. And the first is sort of setting the scene. Why are we here? Why is this relevant? Why would a manifesto like this make sense? Why is it necessary, and why now? And I wanted to give Paul a chance to tell us a little bit more, given his role in the actual crafting of the manifesto and the initiative, of why, why do you think this is relevant, Paul? And, what's your general take on the need for the manifesto or something like the manifesto to come out now? So Paul, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me be concise. I think 5 years ago, it would have been impossible to agree across the Atlantic, even among academics, that there should be a primacy of democracy over technology, and that, as the first headline in the manifesto says, technological solutionism should not replace democracy. I think there was still an unfettered belief that technology will solve all problems of this world. And I think this manifesto shows that is something which is not continuing in the future, this belief, but on the contrary, there are many problems with technology, and we have to re-establish the primacy of democracy over technology, and for that matter also over business models. And that is in fact the second heading of the manifesto, affirming the primacy of democracy. And the third heading is empowering citizens through institutions of countervailing power. So this is also very important, that there is a growing stream, I think, in the world, both in the US and in Europe, but also beyond, which feel that there is too much power vested in big tech. And this is cause for concern. And there are many sources of counterpower, starting from states, which have to be equipped to police these companies. And this is the big debate in the United States and in Europe about competition law and other matters. But going right through to empowered civil society, which must in themselves be able to act in the public interest and, if necessary, also before the judiciary, like, for example, in Europe, Max Schrems and his NGO, None of Your Business, is doing it in Vienna for data protection purposes. So to sum up, I must say I was surprised myself that we were able, right for the visit of President Biden in Brussels on 14th of June, to present this manifesto. I think it has inspired the US initiative on a democracy summit. And I hope that also inside the US, the trend towards rule by law and, reminding that the law is the most noble expression of democracy will gain strength, I think, again. We see a trend which I'm worried about, which is that Europe makes the rules in terms of democratic laws, and the US is just not able to do it. And so I hope this summit this week on democracy, which the US is organizing, is not just a call to the world, but it's also a call inside America to put in place rules which are necessary to frame the activities of big tech.
Yeah, and Paul, let me just have a quick follow-up, because we have a minute or two, but I wanted to sort of extract from you the full argument here, because the thesis is that this wasn't occurring, a dialogue like this wasn't occurring, that regulation wasn't forthcoming, because there was a culture, because there was an ideology, and because there were, a politics that prevented this from happening. Why do you think that this has now changed? I mean, why do you think that now this is possible? And based on your experience in this exercise, that surprised you to some extent, why do you think now we were capable of doing something like this, and there's movement on the regulation of technology companies, as there seems to be?
Well, we have seen President Biden appointing people both to the White House, but also in bodies like the FTC, which stand for, let's say, keeping big tech in check, meaning inside the rules which democracy sets. And I think that's a very important signal. I can also say that, at the time of Obama, every proposal which we made in Brussels for legislation was immediately criticized by the Obama administration, singing from the hymn sheet of big tech. It was a very coordinated exercise at the time. The US government basically just following industrial policy interests of big tech and not having an own line. And this has changed. We have seen the US government relating to the many legislative proposals which are on the table in Europe, take a very positive and supportive stance. And I think that's important. I think it's important that democratic actors don't undermine each other in the common attempt to set democratic rules for the powers of technology and the powers of brute capitalism.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. And well, we have Karina here, who works in one of these large companies that have been recently saying themselves that they think that a lot of these issues should be addressed and regulated. But Karina, what do you make of the of the last few decades of regulation in this space, broadly speaking, and where do you think this debate is going? And what do you make of the manifesto and a document like the one that has now been produced, sitting as you sit in Google, which is one of these very large, successful companies that operate transatlantically and actually globally?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Manuel, and hi, Paul, as well. I think there are a number of points of agreement, right? First of all, of course, technology does not take primacy over the rule of law. Absolutely. Right? I think other things that we agree on, human rights and democracy, democratic values are the foundation of flourishing societies. Yes, and regulation of AI is critical. Right? So there is agreement on all of these points. I think I want to raise a few, items in addition to what's noted in the manifesto, right? And in addition to points Paul has mentioned, right? AI, in addition to some of the risks that do come up, absolutely, it also offers new opportunities to strengthen democracy, right? So if you look at, for example, Google's mission, right? Organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. We have seen many, many ways where, this technology delivery on our mission, use of AI and other advanced technologies really have helped citizens and helped to strengthen democracy in a couple of ways, right? First of all, for example, take Google search, right? If you look more than 20 years ago, the way that people use this tool, actually most people were searching in English. Today, we have people searching in hundreds of languages. You have billions of people around the world, and they're using this to become more informed, including information around polling places and election results and, candidate platforms and things like that. We've seen even in recent elections in the US and Germany, right? This is a tool, this is a technology that can help citizens actually engage more in their democracies, right? Second of all, these technologies can be used by governments themselves to better deliver on promises and public services, right? So floods, for example, we've seen, collaboration with the governments in India and Bangladesh to actually use AI to, develop early warning systems. I think in 2020 alone, we found that, an early warning system powered by the use of AI in collaborations with these governments actually served more than 100 million people and saved over 100 lives. Right? This is really powerful. You can imagine, I think earlier, one of the speakers was talking about the SDGs, all sorts of things that are happening around the world. You can use technology to address these challenges. And then finally, one thing I'll mention, empowering citizens. I think, Paul, you touched on this as well, right? You can actually think about technology as a tool that better empowers citizens to address the problems in their communities and things that they care about. In 2018, we had a $25 million AI impact challenge. We saw awardees in the Netherlands and France and Uganda using AI to actually solve problems in economic opportunity and education and a lot of other areas, right? Technology, again, it doesn't take primacy, but rather it can really serve as a complement. It can help to build more transparent, more accountable, stronger democracies. And I think the real question, and I'm glad we're having this conversation today, right? And many conversations like it, what are the right rules? What are the smart rules that promote all of these advantages, right? Help us to take advantage of these things and strengthen our democracies while minimizing the risk.
Yeah, on that point, Karina, because I think that there are two very clear sort of dimensions to this. One is on the positive aspects of this and how technology enables all sorts of exchanges and new economic activity and brings, prosperity in many, many, many ways and in many fields. I'm just thinking of the health sciences, for example, quite evidently. There was a lot of very advanced technologies involved in the development and deployment of the COVID-19 vaccines, which, by the way, broke all records in terms of speedy development. It took like a tenth of the time that it, if you compare them to others. But there's a second side to this debate, right? Which is the negative externalities of some of these technologies, the impact they have sometimes on employment and on income generation and distribution, the impact they can have on our public debate and how it's structured and affected by external actors, the effect they can have on our privacy and how people can be surveilled and manipulated. So I think that the manifesto is much more targeted at this second dimension. And I know that you yourself have thought about this, and Google as a company is in fact thinking about these things, because you're operating in this space, and these are some of the uses that this technology is enabling and some of the consequences that its deployment is having, right? So when you look at the manifesto, and I'm moving here to the second component of our conversation, because the first was setting the scene. Okay, we haven't had a structured dialogue about this, and there's been a back and forth and some resistance to regulation and to the development of a normative framework around these things. I think there's agreement that we need it. Paul was very adamant on this, and the rest of the colleagues that worked on this manifesto. I know Google and other companies are willing to go into to have this discussion, but on the details, right? And when you look at the manifesto, and you look at some of the policy areas and the details of areas that actually require regulation, what do you make of that? And what are the areas sitting where you sit, where you think actually in these spaces, we do need government action, and we do need concerted action to control these and to minimize these negative externalities that some of these technologies have. So sorry, Karina, back to you. How do you see that space?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Manuel, right? The devil's in the details. You look at the ideas that are, printed and included in the manifesto. I think there's definitely high level agreement on a lot of them, right? You look at some of these ideas like transparency and access, data quality, AI safety, who doesn't want those things? You look at number of the AI principles that have been put out by, various countries, companies, organizations around the world. You see a lot of high level agreement on these things, right? People want more transparency. They want accountability. They want fairness and all of these elements that are listed, right? But the real questions are, okay, what does that actually mean when we go to implementation? How do we get agreement? How do we actually operationalize what is in these high level, principles that are stated? So to take one example, and I think this is in the manifesto, right? The idea of transparency, accountability, access, right? How do we actually get more of that? I think as a company, Google would absolutely agree. Transparency, accountability is critical. In 2018, we released a set of Google AI principles, kind of outlining our own commitment to the responsible development and use of AI, right? And one of the principles we outlined is accountability, right? But again, this idea of specificity. So what kind of information is required? What's important to actually hold algorithms and AI and all the different organizations that are using it accountable? What's the actual information and mechanisms that are needed? We've heard from a lot of different governments. For example, actually, we agree, the source code is not useful. We don't know what to make of it. We're not sure actually how we would use actual, code of the algorithms, but what information is useful? What kind of, more information can we provide? I think at Google, as one example, we have a tool called How Search Works. This is an online resource that really details, the ranking algorithm and how the product works, the privacy and safety and security features inside of the product. Is that enough? Is there more information that's needed? What actually should we be providing here? I think a second question around that: who should have access to it? You can imagine there's also security concerns, right? Who are the right authorities, the right bodies to have this transparency? Because of course, if bad actors, for example, were able to gain access to the search algorithm, you could imagine a lot of people maybe trying to game the system, right? So how do you think about the right bodies, the right people, and the actual right content, right? To take another example, data quality and access. I think that's also listed in the manifesto, right? Again, I think most people would agree, right? Open data, interoperability, standards, these things are all important. Google has released as a company more than 100 open data sets. We use them to train ourselves, translation data sets, speech recognition, language understanding, computer vision. We use them internally. We've also released them externally because we think other people can find them useful, right? Apply to problems that they care about. But open data on its own is, not necessarily just useful, right? How clean does the data have to be? What types of quality standards should we be thinking about, right? The same thing for governments. They've released a number of open data resources. What's required here, right? Second question, what does it actually mean to be interoperable? We've seen, the US Census, the DEA, FBI in the US, for example, they all use different types of information to encode location data, right? I think the DEA has 3-digit zip code, US Census has their own form. How do you actually get things to be interoperable so that they're useful? And then finally, this point on useful data, it takes time. It's not enough to just open up a data set. I think as anybody, in the audience or, who has opened up a data set, it takes a lot of time and ensure the quality of the data, ensure that it's open and in the right format. But most of the time when people are actually looking to use the data, it actually, a lot of the time is spent, looking at data from source to source to source, right? It's a lot of time to engineer the data rather than finding insights. So what are things that we can do? I think at Google, we've released a tool called Data Commons, but this idea of how do we ensure the data is useful, that people can all find different kinds of information in one place, actually means something when we talk about data quality and access.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I mean, there's a ton of issues there on the details of the regulation, which I think is important because at some point we're going to have to get down to the very, very details of this. I have an overarching question here. And Paul, by the way, I'm going to go back to you in a second to see what you make of the specific recommendations and the areas that you think are central. But I have an overarching question here as well, which is on regulator and legislator capacity, because I think a lot of this will have to be done in a dialogue with the corporate world and with people with a lot of technical expertise, if it is to be done right, because it's a complex sector to regulate, even though we're in the process of, in fact, doing a lot of this as we speak. But Paul, what do you make of the recommendations on the manifesto? And how would you catalog them in terms of importance? And which ones do you think are the actual key ones and the ones that we should be working on moving forward?
Well, I think the 17 recommendations of the manifesto actually are, in terms of their ordered more or less, I would say, at least from a civilian point of view, in the order of importance. So the first one is, of course, the issue of power and dominance and abuse of dominance. And so competition law, both its effective enforcement, but potentially also its reform, are key here. Upskilling of supervisory authorities, also creating a platform culture of supervisory authorities. Companies like Google and all the big tech companies, they are basically clients of all the regulators at the same time. The regulators are fragmented, Google and these companies are one. And that's a problem. So we have to establish a new culture of cooperation between regulators across the different issues. And I would say, if you think about, you mentioned, or in the previous panel, I think it was mentioned, the predictive policing. There's a market for predictive policing on individuals. So many police forces all over the world already use these softwares, and you can sell them. But who creates predictive policing software for big tech? Which market does that? I mean, every country only has one competition authorities, and that's what we need. And that's the unfairness of the market. We cannot leave all these issues to the market. We need public investment in predictive policing software and AI to have a check on big tech. And I would think actually big tech should contribute its own knowledge to this. I very much appreciate all the examples of goodness Karina has mentioned. And, I think all this is great, and I'm sure it's true. But there is a lot to be done to balance out all the bad things which are coming from technology gone wild. It's not a coincidence that at the time when the technology is a high point, people stormed on the US Congress. And it is not a coincidence that we don't have predictive policing software on corporations. We only have it for people. And that's the reality of the world we live in. And those who want to do good in those corporations, they should engage within their corporations and beyond that to address this balance. So let me also say that there's hope, coming to the third point of the 17, namely to address the tax-free riding has been possible. I think there's a path now to at least 15% of corporate tax. It's sufficiently low, I would say, seeing the profits these companies are making. They're all at the top 10 of US stock exchange. I would have found it absolutely normal not to have 15, but 25%. But, that is also the political reality of this world with which we have to engage. Right now, it's only possible to agree on the lowest common denominator, which is 15%. So, that shows you what is there for scope for creating fairness and justice relating to big tech. Once we have arrived at a normal company tax rate for these companies too, then I'm happy. And this applies to all the other 17 points. I would say, these companies are able to systematically either soft wash law through their lobbying activities or just not to comply with it. I mean, take Google as an example. Look at all the decisions where Google has been breaking privacy law, data protection law, consumer protection law, and competition law. And is it changing? Do we see less cases now where it has been found to break the law than 10 years ago? Certainly not. So I would say, there's a long way to go until the tech for good talk is credible. I think the first thing is, stop a policy of systematically breaking the law. And once regulators have found the companies to break the law, always going to the last instance in the judiciary, thereby basically telling every regulator, guys, if you take it up with us, we'll bind hundreds of your people for many years because we can afford it. We have the money to engage all the lawyers in the world. We will go to last instance. That is the reality of the power fight which is going on today between private interest and public interest in this tech-dominated world.
Thank you, Paul. On that point, we had a back and forth. I remember we were organizing this session about the need for also better regulation and regulator capacity, and enforcement capacity of a lot of the things that we're discussing today, because I think that many of these are emerging fields, and it's taking a toll on the capacity of our own regulatory authorities to be able to actually put forward frameworks and implement them. So I think that there's a distribution of ability to deal with this that we need to address. But let me move very quickly because we're running out of time. We have a little bit under 7 minutes because this and by the way, thank you, Paul. And I think there are fundamental questions there on competition, on taxation that go to some extent even beyond the technology companies. I mean, they're about the future of our economies and the equity of our economic systems. But this is not taking place in a vacuum, right? When you look at the state of the world, this is taking place in an order that is changing very rapidly, with a rising China, where technologies are deployed and used in a way that many in Europe and the US would consider counter to our interests when it comes to privacy, to surveillance, and others. So, the way we address this and we deal with this will have an implication as to how we can project our own model internationally. So we have a mirror now when it comes to how we govern these things. So I just wonder how you see this from your perspective, Karina. When you think about the global dimension of this, and you operate across borders, right? And you have a lot of activity beyond the United States, beyond Europe. You have a footprint in many other jurisdictions and places. So how does this debate spill over to those areas? Because a lot of the discussions that we're having here they're affected by the fact that we're looking at this through a democratic lens, an individual and human rights lens. They're clearly infused by these principles. How does that affect the way you operate in other places, and how you think about your mission around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the future of democracy is not a given, right? You look, I think even earlier this year, President Biden said, democracy doesn't happen by accident, right? We all together, collectively, we have to defend it, fight for it, strengthen it, renew it, right? And again, this idea of doesn't happen by accident, right? There's no guarantee that this is going to be the direction of history, but technology is a tool to help us strengthen democracies. I think there's a couple of points here. The first, this idea of, I guess people usually talk about public-private partnerships. Audrey Tang from Taiwan has this idea of people, public-private partnerships. I think this is critical, right? This is massive advantage of democracies. Everybody has a voice, everybody can contribute. Speaking as a private company, right? And I think, Paul, you touched on some of these points. Google absolutely has a responsibility to think about what we are doing to help promote democracy, right? That includes things like opening up data. As I mentioned, we've got hundreds of open data sets, models. What does the software look like? How can we share that knowledge with others? How do we make that available? I think we've got, several hundred models that are online, things like translation models and speech recognition, computer vision, really technologies that we've developed ourselves. We want to open it up so others can do it to also advance, right, democracy and all of these, values that we care about. Compute power, for example, in the US, there's an effort right now called the National AI Research Resource. This is actually to try to make compute power more available to other players in the United States, in academia, maybe small business and others. That's an important part of really opening up AI. And then this idea of talent, I think, right, you've got to have talent that creates technologies. Manuel, you talked about, the importance of educating regulators and actually, policymakers being aware of what's happening here in order to regulate this smartly. I think we've put together a machine learning workshop for policymakers. We've had more than 400 policymakers around the world take it. For those on the call, if you are interested, please reach out because we think it is very important, right? This is not information that we should be hoarding inside of private companies. We have to develop it ourselves to deliver on our mission, right? We think that's important, but we're also opening it up and we're making it available because we want everybody to be more educated, to be able to use it for good, as you were mentioning, Paul, and to be able to come up with smart rules, right? Companies aren't going to be able to come up with smart rules and certainly not on our own. We have to all work together, share expertise, and actually be informed on the issues, be informed on all of the concerns that are out there so we can come up as society with the best types of rules that are out there, right? This other idea, secondly, what do we need to do? Again, thinking globally, I think democracies have to work together and we all have to, think about how we complement each other, how the different countries work together, and importantly, invest in long-term basic research, right? This is going to be the underpinning, what's going to enable the industries of the future. This is going to enable democracies to succeed. We don't have enough resources, I think, for every country to recreate the wheel on their own, certainly not for every company to recreate the wheel on our own, but how we work together and how we invest in long-term R&D, that's going to be critical.
Thank you, Karina. We have a few minutes left, Paul, and I want to bring the same question to you. And I think there's a lot here at stake, and because the way we manage this will have, very, very big ramifications and impact for the global debate. The way that these technologies are regulated here at home in democratic countries will say a lot about the type of technology that we want to see globally, and just to be fair, I think that there's, and I was a policymaker until very recently, and I have to say in a foreign ministry, I mean, the challenge that this poses to policymakers is enormous. And we have these very powerful regulatory tools, which are called laws. In your case, Paul, sitting, and working at the European Commission, they have different names, but they're extremely powerful regulatory instruments at all levels. But we need to know how to use them and when to use them, right? And I think there's a level of responsibility there on policymakers that is enormous domestically, but it's also enormous globally and internationally because it's sending a signal out there. So how do you see this global piece in this discussion that we're having? And the manifesto is clearly transatlantic, right? So there's already a normative content to that, but or normative implications. But tell us, Paul, how do you see this playing out in the international arena?
Well, the best, of course, would be if the United States, as the traditional democracy leading the world, would set rules itself for a big tech. And every time this doesn't happen, this creates, of course, difficulties and conflicts, because we in Europe, we must set these rules. This is what our constitutional settlement requires. But of course, things would be much smoother and easier if Congress would get its act together and if American democracy would deliver. That's my first point. My second point is, of course, we have global dialogue and we try to do things in convergence, but at the end, like on GDPR and other things, we are a democracy in Europe and we must set our rules, and eventually we have to act, if necessary, unfortunately also on our own. We cannot be held up by, whether it's China or the US, just not moving forward. this being said, I think a lot can be done for the corporations to play a much more constructive role in this process. I would think, for example, that a company like Google, and for that matter, all the big GAFAM companies, the big five at least, should be able to participate in these dialogues and in the discourse, in the societal discourse on, the rules we need, not always having their own business interest and business objectives, at the forefront of their mind. I think they are big enough. They are, bigger than many states of this world. I think if they would take serious what Karina is saying here, they would make abstraction of their, next profitability goal at the US stock exchange when they participate in these debates, and of this or that business model they have. And they would really, join, as you said, Manuel, this huge difficulty of getting tech regulation right. But as, amicus curiae, or for that matter, amicus democraticus, a friend of democracy, not someone who constantly in the back door, pursues the own business interest. And we have seen the worst examples of this in Brussels in the ongoing legislative processes, and not only from Google, I have to be fair. So, that would be my wish. And I think there is a long way to go to this. And if the companies would do this, they would still be among the most profitable in this world. But, this is what I would think should be the next step of tech business for good. Make abstraction of your profitability interests, of your business models, and participate with your deep knowledge on the functioning of the world and of your own technology and their impacts, because you only know best. You know this. In a public discourse which really serves the common public interest. That would be my wish. And let's hope, we make progress in this direction too. My unfortunate personal experience is big business lies. When they come to parliaments, when they come to the regulator, they lie. And, the Commission regularly has to impose hundreds of millions of euros of fines because big tech has lied. Would be great if that ends. And if we can rely on, the information about business model, technology potentials, research projects, and so on, which comes from big tech, that would already be a great progress.
Thank you, Paul. We've run out of time, and I don't want to end this without thanking you both, and thanking also Karina for being here and participating in this dialogue, which actually proves your point, Paul, that a lot of these companies are very willing to participate in this dialogue, bearing in mind that they are companies and they have their own interests and they have shareholders and they have a mission that they also need to fulfill. But I find that they're very willing to engage in this debate, like Karina was saying at the beginning. And we have also legislators that need to do their jobs and they need to be well informed. So it's a very complicated topic. I don't think we're going to get this regulation right if we don't get these two sides of the table to sit down and to work out effective solutions to many of the challenges that we have. So extremely relevant conversation. I want to thank you both for a very lively and open discussion and debate that went all the way from the 30,000 feet of why are we here to actually the specifics of some elements contained in the manifesto and issues to work on. Thank you, everybody that is connected and that has followed this. And thank you to the Athens Roundtable for the discussion. And I hope you have a wonderful time in the remainder of the roundtable. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Karina. And thank you, everybody.